Last time, we talked about the evolution of moral behavior in animals. And today we're going to go on to a very in-depth discussion of moral behavior in another animal, namely humans. And we're going to be looking at the nature of that morality. We'll talk about some experiments where people have probed moral thinking in humans. And then we'll end up in part 3 talking about how we can biologicize, that terrible word that E.O. Ilson begat, how we can biologicize our understanding of morality and incorporate that understanding of the biological basis of morality into an understanding of the biological basis of religion, that thing that morality is often conflated with but should not be. But nonetheless, if we understand the biological basis of the moral faculty in humans, which we consider to be genetic, having been bequeathed to us by some ancient ancestor that also parlayed the same capacities in our great ape cousins, there also is a corresponding biological basis for the ultimate expression of moral behavior in humans, not so much, well, not at all in other animals, in that thing we call religion. So understanding where the biological basis of moral thinking comes from helps us understand where the biological basis of religious thought comes from. So we might begin here with a couple of comments on the nature of morality in humans as defined by a variety of people, largely philosophers and psychologists, over many, many decades have had a lot to say about this. And one of the key arguments about the nature of morality in humans is whether or not morality sprang from reason or whether it was from something else. So we have philosophers such as Kant and Piaget who studied the development of moral reasoning in children to see when the capacity for moral thought began, and that led to certain conclusions about the nature of morality itself. When we get to the psychologists and the psychological literature, there was an absolute prohibition, which was promoted by B.F. Skinner, the famous behaviorist, that we could not discuss, we had no right to discuss the idea of morality in animals because that was a very evident case of anthropomorphism, which was absolutely verboten. People didn't like to think that. So we had this ongoing tension between those who thought that morality came from reason, including Kant, who promoted this idea, and others who thought that that was ridiculous. So how do we get beyond these dimorphic classifications? Well, another person, Jonathan Haidt of the University of Virginia, has been studying the nature of morality for quite a long time and broke the logjam in the thoughts about where morality comes from and what it all means. Haidt was doing some experiments on the emotion of disgust. And so in trying to explain the nature of his research to other people, particularly people who are not scientists, he recounted a couple of stories that kind of pulled his thoughts together. One was the story of a family, very impoverished family. They had nothing to eat, and their pet dog, as it turned out, died of natural causes or was hit by a car, we're not sure. But they ate the dog after it had been killed. And people who were asked to comment on the story found that to be disgusting, terrible, because the dog was a family friend. How could you eat him? And yet the dog had been killed, so why not eat him if you're hungry and there's no food? Another story that seems to bring the elements of disgust into sharp focus is one in which a woman took an American flag and used it to clean her toilet. And that, too, was viewed as highly disgusting by the people who heard the story. And again, one should ask why. The flag is an inanimate object. There's no reason why one shouldn't use it to clean your toilet, and yet it was highly offensive. And that relates to the nature of our understanding of and respect for the country that we live in, and the flag is a symbolic measure of our affection for the country, and therefore to use it as a rag was viewed as offensive. So everybody basically agreed that these two things were highly wrong. They're just wrong. But, and here's the important element, no one could articulate the reason why these things were wrong. No one had been injured in these activities, so why were these things wrong? And the point here is not to explain so much why people thought they were wrong, but Haight argued that if you cannot explain the basis for your moral judgment, then it isn't coming from reason. In other words, the philosophers like Kant were wrong. Morality is not the product of your reason at work. It comes from somewhere else. And Haight goes on to argue, very compellingly, I think, that there are two kinds of moral judgment. And this helps to explain two things. Both the reasons why we do things, why our moral judgment is in play, and also why there's a difference in the morality shown by humans and other animals. So the first kind of moral judgment is, according to Haight, type 1. And this is also known descriptively as moral intuition, which emanates from the unconscious mind and is the kind of morality that we access intuitively. It doesn't require thought, it's reflexive, and it's found not only in humans, but in other animals. So this is the point, type 1 moral judgment, where the two forms, where the moral faculty overlaps and covers both humans and other animals. So this kind of resolves why animals seem to have some sort of morality. It's not the same as humans, but they have some capacity to exercise moral judgment, and yet it's not the same as humans. But there's a second type of morality, which conveniently Haight calls type 2 morality, and this is a slower, after-the-fact, more processed kind of moral reflection that is governed by the conscious mind. One would say the neocortex, the executive part of the brain, and is intellectual in nature. And this type of moral judgment is not found in non-human animals, at least as far as we know, requires language to be productive, and that alone can explain why we see this in humans but not in other animals. So these two kinds of moral judgment come from different parts of the brain. One is intuitive and is probably underwritten in places like the limbic system. The other is governed by the conscious mind, and that is coming from where we make those conscious executive decisions in the prefrontal cortex. The intuitive part is clearly genetic, and that's why we share the type 1 morality with other animals. It's a genetic component that was instilled by natural selection, and it's common in animals with big brains. The type 2 moral judgment, however, is not universally found in animals and seems to come from elsewhere rather than necessarily the genetic process that led to the establishment of type 1 moral reasoning very broadly among animals. Now, we are accustomed to the exercise of type 1 morality, but we don't always proceed to type 2 morality. And when and if we do, we often find it difficult to come up with explanations for why we did it. And that's what we were seeing in play in the Haight experiment with the dog, dead dog, and the American flag. The type 2 process is unique to humans, but if we have to examine our type 1 judgment, we don't always come up with a convincing argument for why we did it. And that's simply because it is reflexive, it is innate, it is intuitive, it is not the product of thought, whereas type 2 morality is. The philosophers also will tell us that there's an age-specific acquisition of moral thinking. There was a raging argument for centuries about whether children had any moral capacity at all. Kant thought they did, others thought that they did not. But the finding that there is moral behavior, if you measure it properly and have the appropriate tests to probe it, there is moral behavior in young children also suggests that there is a genetic foundation for it. And we see a process in moral thinking development in children that's very static. It doesn't change among humans or cultures. So by age 3, children have a fairly good understanding of what things are good and what things are bad. Usually these are actions. By ages 3 to 6, children start to feel guilt if the behavioral norms are violated. And the interesting thing, as I previously said, is that children all over the world follow roughly the same sequence, again suggesting an underlying genetic basis. So the moral faculty, like the acquisition of language by humans, develops in a progressive way over time with teaching in addition to its genetic basis. And this is part of the very important function of human caregivers during the growth of children. One of the major tasks that human beings are learning is the moral code and how to stay on the right side of moral decisions. So here's a table taken from one of Haight's papers that contrasts the two kinds of moral thinking that we've been discussing. On the left side here, we have the intuitive system, which is the type 1 moral thinking. So to summarize, it's fast and effortless. The process occurs without intention. It runs automatically. What else do I want you to know? It does not demand additional attentional resources. Again, that's because it's intuitive. The other important point is that type 1 moral thinking is common to all mammals. So this is the moral component that we share with the animals who are not us. In contrast, we have the type 2 moral thinking, which he is subtitling here, the reasoning system. In contrast to type 1, type 2 is slow and effortful. It requires thought, it requires attention, etc. The process is intentional and controllable, unlike the type 1, which is automatic and runs without your active intervention to consider it. What else? The other important point is that type 2 is unique to humans over age 2, although perhaps it can be found in some degree in language-trained apes. One of the major components of the type 2 moral reasoning is the ability to compare your actions to the standard against which you're being held. And this requires, at least to some degree, the ability to speak, to have language. And that's why we don't see it in humans until they reach age 2 or over. And that's why we don't see it in animals, because they don't have language. They can't articulate their moral reasoning. They can't compare it to group norms and explain why or why not they didn't violate those norms. So this is a fundamental distinction with which you will want to be familiar. So moral intuition, type 1, and moral reasoning, type 2, are two separate processes. Moral intuition evolved first and is found in other mammalian species. Beyond that, we don't know. Do earthworms have a moral faculty? I would suspect not, but I can't say that with authority. Moral reasoning probably developed after language acquisition for the reasons I just mentioned, when we had to explain our moral thinking to others in our tribe. Why did you do that thing? You need to come up with a good, convincing explanation, or they might be somewhat upset with you. And that's why animals stopped at the moral intuition stage. They don't have the language skills to articulate how their actions comport with the group norms. The biological basis for morality has also been studied, sometimes quite by accident, usually when the brain has been injured in certain places, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is situated just under the bridge of your nose. Damage to that area of the brain pretty routinely results in antisocial behavior and poor moral judgment. The classical case of this occurred to a man named Phineas Gage back in 1848, whose picture you see here. He was, as a young man, a very dependable man, a moral man, a guy who was looked up to. He had a fairly good job with the railroad company in a supervisory capacity. He was in charge of overseeing the laying down of new tracks. And that requires a fair amount of the use of explosives to clear the ground where the tracks will be laid. And one day he was out there doing his supervisory thing, and somebody forgot to put sand in the blast mixture, which apparently is a big no-no. I know nothing about blowing things up, but apparently that's part of the process that's essential. The sand wasn't there, so the mixture exploded prematurely, and Gage happened to be leaning over the area where the bomb-making materials were situated, and the explosion resulted in an iron spike being blown up into the air, and through his head it entered, the spike entered the lower part of the skull. It traveled up through the prefrontal cortex and exited the top of his head. Sounds terrible. It was. Nobody expected him to live, but in fact, he not only survived the experiment, he survived the experience. He walked away from it. He was fully conscious, even though you could see his brain tissue on the spike after it emerged. So nobody expected him to live, and indeed, within a couple of days, he went into a deep coma. And because we didn't have antibiotics at this time, his brain became infected, and that was something that was thought would kill him off. But they called in a doctor who had experience with treating brain infections, and he was able to pull Gage through the trauma. And although he survived it, bodily at least, there were severe changes in his behavior after he recovered from the accident. He was able to walk, he could talk, and so forth, but whereas before he'd been an upstanding member of society, a guy you could count on, a guy who was church-going, after the accident, all of those desirable behaviors went away. He was profane, he was antisocial, he routinely exercised supremely bad judgment about just about everything. He lost his job. Eventually, he ended up in South America, where he was able to get employment. Prior to going to South America, he had been reduced to performing in basically freak shows as his only source of income, and he died as a young man, probably as a cumulative trauma that was induced by the spike that went through his head. So his moral judgment and character changed radically after his prefrontal cortex had been invaded by this very large spike. And we also see this kind of behavioral change in people who get Huntington's disease, which we know kind of eats away at your prefrontal cortex. And one of the hallmark changes that take place in Huntington's patients is that they become very utilitarian about moral judgments. They weigh only the consequences. They ignore the social improprieties attached to those consequences. Now, let's talk about a couple of interesting studies that have attempted to probe the nature of moral reasoning and judgment in humans. And here again, we'll revisit the type 1 versus type 2 moral reasoning. And this experiment is generally known as the trolley car problem, and it's supposed to exemplify the nature of moral reasoning. So what you have here is a train coming down a track, and you see 5 people walking along that track, oblivious to the fact that a train is bearing down on them, and if they don't move off the track, they're going to be killed. And you just happen to be an observer of this impending calamity, and you are also, as a person on a bridge overseeing this, in a position to flip a switch that will divert the train to a sidetrack, but that diversion will have a consequence, which is that it will cause the train to kill a single hiker, but it will save the 5. So the moral question is, do you perform this action that will save the 5 people walking along the track, but will kill another person in the process? What do? You save the 5 and kill the 1? That's the moral question. So, assuming that it is a good thing to save 5 people, even if it means you have to inadvertently kill 1, this question was put to an audience of undergraduate students at Harvard, and among that population, most people agreed, 90% said, that it was a moral thing to flip that switch, kill the 1 person inadvertently, but thereby save the 5. So thousands of people at Harvard were given this task to make this moral judgment, and that's what they said. But if we change the scenario slightly, all of a sudden, the moral judgment is not so clear. We have basically the same setup. We have 5 people walking down that train track again, having learned nothing from the first scenario. They're back at it. And this time, you're on a bridge again, and you don't have a switch that you can press to divert the train. However, there is a heavy object that you can throw over the railing to land in front of the train that hopefully would slow it down enough to save the 5 people. And the heavy object you have at your disposal is an overweight human being standing next to you on the bridge. So, same question. Should the observer, which is you, throw the fat man over the railing onto the tracks below to stop the advancing train and, as a consequence, save the 5 people? Well, this time, the Harvardians said basically no. Only 10% of the students at Harvard thought that it was a moral thing to kill the fat man in order to save the 5 people, again, stupidly walking on the train tracks. So why is this? The outcome is exactly the same as in the first scenario. 1 person is sacrificed to save 5. But when asked to articulate a reason why it was not okay in the second scenario, 70% of the students from Harvard were unable to articulate a reason why. It just seemed wrong. It was just intuitive moral reasoning, or type 1 moral reasoning, that comes to you quickly, effortlessly, innately, but sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly why you did it. Again, if we can't articulate a reason, how can we teach morality? You have to be able to explain why this is right or why this is wrong. But again, this is the nature of type 1 moral reasoning. If you really press the Harvard students for an answer, some began to articulate ideas about why those decisions were correct. In the second case, some articulated the so-called contact principle. That is to say, it wasn't okay to push the fat man over the railing onto the tracks because it required the observer to have actual physical contact with the fat man. And the fact that that contact was required rather than just remotely flipping a switch seemed to be important in forming the difference for these two scenarios. In other words, the further you are away from something, the less contact you have with it, the less immoral it seems to cause someone to reach his demise. And sort of we do this in real life, right? If we see an injured child along the roadside, I think almost all of us would stop, try to help that child, try to get that child back to his parents, call an ambulance, take the child to the hospital, something like that. We would do something to help. But if you see an equally at-risk starving child in a magazine, as we all do, we're sitting at the dentist's office, we're flipping through the Reader's Digest, and there's this big advertisement telling us that children are starving all over the world, and for 50 cents a day you can save them and all this stuff. But how many of us actually write that check? Not many of us do, because there's this distance between us and those children. And just seeing a picture is not the same as seeing the actual injured child, even though in the end the situations are basically the same. A child is in danger and the child needs help. On the one hand, if the child is in front of us, we might take steps to alleviate that suffering. If the child is thousands of miles away and in a magazine, we probably won't take that step. Another thing that the Harvardians offered as explanatory is the so-called intention principle. In the first scenario we discussed, the observer saw that the hiker would be killed by the train if it were not diverted. But that is to say, the observer did not intend for the hiker to be killed. It was simply an unfortunate byproduct of the necessary activity he had to undertake to save the 5. However, in the second scenario, the observer on the bridge actually intended to kill the fat man. It wasn't an accident, it was an intentional act which resulted in the death of the fat man in order to save the 5. So, in the view of the Harvard students, moral thinking makes a distinction between intentional acts, which are not okay, and non-intentional acts, which are okay. Now, we can argue about whether or not there really is that distinction between intentional and non-intentional in these two examples, because even though the intention to kill the hiker was not there in the first one, it was a byproduct of the person's action and a known byproduct of that action. So even though the intention was once removed from the action, it was still a consequence, and so it was therefore part of the moral decision. But the thing that you can take away from this discussion is that what I've been talking about, the contact principle, the intention principle, these are examples of type 2 moral thinking, where you reflect upon what you've done and the nature of the conflict that you had to navigate in order to reach a decision. That is type 2 moral thinking. And here's a third scenario, because we're back on the bridge. And this time, again, those 5 people are out there yucking it up on the tracks. And at this point, we have a slightly different scenario. There are 3 people on the bridge. the fat man, observer 1, and observer 2. So, in this scenario, the reason for making the moral decision was articulated as the action principle. And the idea here is that harm caused by an action taken is worse than harm caused by omission of taking that action. So the setup in this case is that the first observer can pull a lever to dump the fat man onto the track. So there must be like a door in the floor of the track, or the platform. You can pull the lever, open the door. The fat man is sitting on top of that door, and so pulling the lever will cause the fat man to drop down onto the tracks and ostensibly slow down the train. But observer 2, taking all of this in, can pull a lever that would stop the fat man from falling to his death. But if he doesn't do this, if he doesn't pull his lever, then the fat man will fall onto the tracks and he will die. Now, let's note that the potential actions of both observer 1 and observer 2 have precisely the same effect, which is to say the fat man will die. But the Harvard students decided that morally, the potential action taken by observer 1 was more troubling because his action directly resulted in the man's death, but the omission of an action by observer 2 is what would result in the fat man's death. So taking that action is more troubling than simply not taking the same action, but having precisely the same effect. Now, you might complain that all of these scenarios are just stupid. First of all, if 5 people are walking on the tracks, that in itself is a dumb thing. But more to the point, why wouldn't the person on the bridge just yell at the 5 people on the track and say, hey, you guys, a train is coming. You might want to get off the track. So that didn't happen. Another problem with this is, okay, let's say you have this poor fat man up there on the bridge with you. Honestly, throwing a fat man in front of an oncoming train is not going to do anything to the train. It'll kill the fat man, but it will not stop the train, and therefore the 5 people will die. Another problem, logical problem with this is, if you were the railroad company, why would you put a lever that could cause for a random stranger to show up and divert a train from its track anywhere near a person could actually access that lever? So these are just a couple of reasons why the whole trolley car scenario is really kind of dumb. But the point is not to come up with questions that would actually occur in the real world. The point is to probe your moral thinking and ask you to identify why those decisions being made were moral or not moral, because that's where the interesting information is gleaned. All right, so let's see if we can connect our two-part moral system in humans, type 1 and type 2 moral behavior, to human biology. Why do we have a two-part moral system? Well, the reality is, out there on the savannah, where hunter-gatherers were trying to eke out an existence with the skills that they had, out there, humans are pretty much like any other mammal. You have to make split-second decisions. Your survival depends upon that ability to quickly respond to conditions as they exist and as they change. And that's why it is good, which is to say selectively advantageous, to have an intuitive moral compass to inform those rapid decisions that have to be made. Later, once you've done whatever you need to do, and you get back safely to the camp, you sit around with your tribe mates, you have dinner, you reflect upon the day's events, you might talk about the moral decision you had to make very quickly using your type 1 moral thinking. But now, sitting with your tribe mates, you need to reflect upon the nature of that decision and whether or not it comports with the ethos of the tribe. And if it doesn't, you may have to account for your moral behavior, and you may be held to some sort of punishment as a result of that moral behavior. But this is where the type 2 moral thinking comes in, and this is the part that is uniquely human because it requires language and the ability to compare outcomes and the consequences of those outcomes and that sort of thought process, which requires, as I said, language. So the type 2 morality is essential to the construction of a productive and responsive society among humans. The social fabric is demonstrably stronger if everybody has roughly the same intuitive understanding of right and wrong. In other words, type 1 moral thinking. But the social fabric can be rent, or it can be strengthened by agreement on type 2 moral thinking, and these are the things that are negotiated through language and through experience. Both of these kinds of moral thought need to be taught to children, making that function particularly important. Now, if we appeal to Darwin for some insight into the nature of human moral thought, Darwin argued that social behavior arose as basically a defense against predators, or as a consequence of having to defend against predators. He said, all animals living in a body which defend themselves or attack their enemies must indeed be in some degree faithful to one another, and those that follow a leader must be in some degree obedient. So what Darwin is saying here is that you have to organize the chaos in order to survive, and that chaos can be external forces beyond your immediate control, or it can be internal, and that would be the relationship with others in a group. According to Darwin, social instincts, including morality, derive from this imperative. So human social instincts are the same as mammals, except that in addition to adding in type 2 moral thought, we also have developed a suite of behaviors that are responsive to moral decisions. We want to be admired by our peers, so this quest for admiration is a part of our moral code. We also feel remorse when we transgress those norms. We have the capacity to actively seek and articulate the need for repentance. We feel regret, and we add shame and behaviors that illustrate that shame also to the mix. Now, Darwin's ideas about morality were largely dismissed in his time. They were very unpopular. His contemporaries were really against anthropomorphism. They did not want to blur the lines between human morality and what animals may or may not do. It just doesn't seem like a matter of science to be probing morality in animals. But the relative point here is that Darwin viewed human social behavior not as a dichotomy, not as a black and white situation, but as a continuum with, yes, black and white occupying the two ends of the continuum, but a lot of shades of gray in between. Other thinkers didn't agree that natural selection shaped morality, although after hate it became a fairly standard understanding of how this works. It was also thought if morality was in fact genetic, that it must have arisen as an unintended byproduct of some other process that was in fact selected for. But we now no longer have that point of view. It is clear to scientists who study behavior that morality is part of the genetic underpinning of our biological heritage, and that selection did have the capacity to select for moral behavior. But again, anthropomorphism was always playing around the edges and certainly molded and in some ways impeded our ability to understand morality as a biological function. A big change in attitude about all of this took place in the early 1970s with the publication of Ed Wilson. He again is the Harvard scientist who is in fact an entomologist. He's an ant specialist. But his ability to study ants who are highly social, have a very advanced social structure, allowed him to have some thoughts about human moral behavior and the kinds of evolutionary processes that would select for particular kinds of behavior, which he published in a book called Sociobiology. Now, at the time, the book caused a great stir. Some people thought it was revelatory, that it was a huge advance in our quest to understand the development of behavior in humans. Others were absolutely livid that it got published. One of the implications was if human behavior is genetic in origin, then those who believed in biological determinism, namely that your genes are the ultimate arbiter of your behavior in this case, was that, well, women probably shouldn't hold office and have important positions because their behavior is often emotional and not objective. That was the reigning idea at the time because of the 1960s and the changes in our understanding of the two sexes had created hope among women, particularly that they would be treated more fairly in the job market. And then the publication of Sociobiology seemed to throw that all back into play and open the same questions that women thought had been answered, and we had all moved on to a more productive phase. And now Wilson was saying this, and so at scientific meetings, it was not uncommon for Wilson to be approached by critics. In one case, they dumped a bucket of water on his head, and so it was pretty crazy and ugly often. But honestly, most of the ideas enunciated in sociobiology have found to have great currency and explanatory power. So we need to keep this in mind as we go through this material. Nonetheless, there were lots of complaints about the ideas presented in sociobiology. The idea that behavior was itself biological in nature and the subject of natural selection continued to find resistance among scientists. And what they needed was a model to explain how it might have evolved if, in fact, it was the grist for the mill of natural selection. At which point, Richard Alexander came into the argument, and he argued that one of the big differences between humans and other organisms is that humans can be preyed upon by things like lions and tigers and bears, but in addition, humans actually experience more danger from other humans. In other words, the major predator of humans is not lions and tigers and bears, but other humans. And so he also envisioned a sort of dichotomy in the nature of predation between different animals. He felt that the herd animals, like deer and wildebeest and so forth, were largely preyed upon by the big predators like lions and tigers and bears. But there was a a single predator, and similarly, lions and tigers and bears were preyed upon by other lions and tigers and bears. So in both cases, mammals seem to have one kind of predator, but humans break that rule in the sense that there are two kinds of predators, of which humans themselves are the more important predator in terms of exerting selective pressure. So humans are fundamentally different from other animals because they are preyed upon by these big carnivorous animals, but also, and particularly, other humans. And we know that this was the case back in the hunter-gatherer days. There was just incessant warfare among the tribes. We discussed previously that when we got to the hunter-gatherers, a lot of the innate violence stopped occurring within groups, but was transferred to within tribe hostilities. And we know that as our social complexity and our intelligence grew, we had a need for greater self-restraint because of our bellicose nature. And now, as our intelligence expanded and our brain grew bigger, the ability to make and deploy lethal weapons was also enhanced. So to the extent that humans were the major hostile force against humans, and as our capacity to kill and maim and otherwise injure people became greater, there had to be a moral prohibition against at least violence among tribe members, and moral codes to underwrite that prohibition so that mankind didn't simply kill itself into extinction. But again, because of the fact that humans can be killed both by big carnivores and also other humans, this had a very different impact on the evolution of our moral behavior than was the case in animal groups. Humans are sort of this Frankensteinian monster created by the amalgamation of diverse parts, and the diverse parts come into play because of the differing selective pressures coming from the fact that we have two major kinds of predators on humans. So in that sense, Wilson says that we are evolutionary chimera, a reflection of this amalgamation of different parts coming together to form the complete human. And with this understanding, with Haight's comments and with Wilson's ideas, we're in a position now to give a better biological-sized definition of morality, that it takes into account the biology that we've been talking about. Again, appealing to Wilson, quote, "We understand morality as a sense of right and wrong that is born out of group-wide systems of conflict management based on shared values. Moral systems thus provide a set of rules and incentives to resolve competition and conflicts within the group in service of the greater good." So benefits to individuals derive from the group benefits of resource distribution and collective action. So we have some emerging new foundational behaviors, including suppression of within-group violence, and also the idea that cooperation is superior to competition, at least in some settings. And these are new and novel elements of biology that are found in humans and that whose presence among the hunter-gatherers was pivotal in securing their success. So, human morality came from our primate ancestors. We inherited the moral intuitive process as a result of natural selection from our early primate ancestors. Moral reasoning evolved with the neocortex, the executive part of the brain, and its major function was to justify one's actions to the group. It was important to individuals to maintain a high reputation within the group. And behaviors developed in humans to promote compliance to the group standards. One thing that is kind of pernicious and persists today is the tendency of small groups of people to become gossipy. And what this means is that within a small group, people are watching all the time. They're recording what you've done, what you've said, and whether or not it is in accord with the group understanding of the way things should be. People are capable of forming elaborate scorecards about the behavior of others. And this, too, is part of our moral code and part of our moral understanding. Recall that the hunter-gatherers didn't have an alpha male to exert the punishments, and they didn't have a penal code. So what did they do to force behavior that was in accord with a group understanding of how things should be? Well, one way is to have this gossip function that meant that A, you were being watched, and B, people were taking into account what they judged to be your behavior. And so this was designed and promoted by natural selection because it helped keep the within-group violence down, and it also meant that there would be prohibitions against being stingy and not sharing resources. And this, of course, would be critical to the notion of cooperation within the group, which, as we've already said, was so important for human success in the hunter-gatherer world. Really, the ultimate sanction for bad behavior, whether it was being violent when you shouldn't have been or being avaricious, taking too much of the resources, not distributing it equally, or not helping procure those resources. If you were doing that, people were taking account of that behavior, they would gossip about it, and the ultimate sanction would be to be kicked out of the group for bad behavior. And that was, in essence, a death sentence. If you're kicked out, you don't have access to those group resources, the food, the shelter, all of that. Nor do you have access to other humans to help you fend off predators, whether they're animal or human in nature. And if you think about that concept of telling a group member, okay, your behavior is just so awful that you're no longer part of the group, that happens in modern societies in places like the Amish. If you do various things, you might be shunned. You might be told, okay, you are no longer welcome here, go away. And today it's painful and it can have unfortunate consequences. But back in the days of hunter-gatherers, it wasn't merely painful and unfortunate, it was potentially lethal. And so there would have been very strong selective pressure to prevent having behavior that was so outlandish that you would not be accepted within the group. So, to the extent that that was the case, that bad behavior could get you shunned, the fear of disapproval was basically solidified into an imperative. In other words, good ideas that you ought to do became ideas that you absolutely must do. And as I mentioned previously, humans have pushed this to the ultimate. We have developed a suite of behaviors to broadcast either that we know that we've violated the rules and or that we're sorry about that. So things like blushing, turning bright red, showing that you're embarrassed about something that you said or done is uniquely human. We don't know of any other animal that does this, in part because humans don't have a body that's completely covered with hair, and therefore you can see the blush in the face. Whereas in other animals, the liberal coverage with fur prevents blushing from being seen. But our ability to blush and to show shame and remorse for something we've done is really important. We have other behaviors that do similar things and continually reinforce the broadcasting of discomfort over a violation of the group rules. So we have not only a moral understanding of our behavior and what it means, we have a variety of different ways to show other members of our tribe that we understand when we've done something wrong, and we have the capacity also to broadcast that we're sorry for that, which is likely to keep your position in the group. If you can say, not only do I get it, but I'm really sorry that I did that stupid thing. And therefore, we are very well endowed with behavioral features that have the collective effect of solidifying and maintaining our position in the group, which is imperative to survival, or was imperative to survival back in the days of the hunter-gatherers. But of course, with those really big brains, came other abilities as well, like people being able to think for themselves, people being able to calculate what would be in their own individual best interest, even if it violated group norms, particularly if you could obfuscate your responsibility for that violation and blame it on another. So with this reality, the fact that the really big brain allowed us to do a fair amount of calculating how we could serve our own best interests, even if it violated the group norms, particularly if we could cover it up or deflect the blame onto somebody else. With that reality, some sort of new enforcement mechanism was needed, because it wasn't enough just to have the available ones. And this is, of course, where religion, its attendant codification of the moral code within it, and the ability to have a supernatural overseer mete out punishment became a thing that was essential. And here is your study guide for the moral ape and trolley car experiments.